Shalom, and welcome to another edition here on the Genesis 49ers page, where we say no to vague interpretations and we give thorough breakdowns.
Shalom, and welcome here to the Genesis 49ers page, where we say no to vague interpretations and we give thorough breakdowns. Today's topic is going to be on the Vagrancy Act, peonage, and various laws that kept African Americans in slavery, and also Native Indians that were considered colored, because we had a binary race system, which was you either fall in the category of black or white, and they judged. They made these bases based off observations, meaning your skin color. And a lot of Native Indians were dark skinned, had woolly hair, so they had to go under the Jim Crow laws and the different vagrancy laws and all these racist laws that were based on color. A lot of people don't understand it, and a lot of people don't even know what the Vagrancy Act is. So today we're putting it on ourselves to educate our people in the community about the Vagrancy Act and peonage, and how slavery was extended for several years, several decades later. And it's very important and pertinent to know this information, to know the state of our people today, because we really have been crippled in society. So let's get right into it. You can see the page. This is from encyclopediavirginia.org. Okay, and I will be posting the links to the articles within the description of the video below. So if you want to read the articles yourself or share them, they will be located in the description below. So it says Vagrancy Act of 1866, contributed by Brent Tarter. The Vagrancy Act of 1866, passed by the General Assembly on January 15, 1866, forced into employment for a term of up to 3 months in any person who appeared to be unemployed or homeless. Now, this affected African Americans because what just happened in 1865, they were freed from chattel slavery. But a lot of these African Americans had trouble finding work, and they were vagrant, and they had nowhere to go because they just left their slave masters they've been living with all their lives. So they would fall into this Vagrancy Act. The purpose of this Vagrancy Act was to criminalize them so they can sell them back into slavery, which is what we're going to get into. It says, if so-called vagrants ran away and were recaptured, they would be forced to work for no compensation while wearing balls and chains. More formally known as the Act providing for the punishment of vagrants, the law came shortly after the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, when hundreds of thousands of African Americans, many of them just freed from slavery, wandered in search of work and displaced family members. As such, the act criminalized free people attempting to rebuild their lives, and perhaps was intended to contradict Governor Francis H. Pierpoint's public statement discouraging punitive legislation. So I just want to make a quick side note before we continue. You have to understand something. The law has always been racist, and to this day it's racist. It doesn't have to explicitly say we do not like black people or this law is against black people. It doesn't have to say that verbatim for it to be racist, because this law, the Vagrancy Act, did not state it was against African Americans, but it was written in the intent to do what? Criminalize African Americans. It's obvious. And guess what? Once they got rid of one law, what they do? They went back to Congress, legislation, and made a new law to trap us again. That's the same practice they do in perpetuity. They keep doing this same practice. We complain about a law, we might win in the courts, they make another law, and then we're back at square one. So let's get back to the article. It says, shortly after its passage, the commanding general in Virginia, Alfred H. Terry, issued a proclamation declaring that the law would reinstitute slavery in all but its name and forbidden its enforcement. Proponents argue that the law applies to all people regardless of race. Now, that's what they do today, like with the cabaret law in New York, which was originally made to target black people that were in Harlem, New York. That was the intent. Now, it doesn't say verbatim, this law is against black people owning dance halls or something like that. They have to have a cabaret license. It doesn't say that, but the intent is obvious, therefore making that law racist. And people are fighting to get it repealed. Why do you have to fight to get something like that repealed? It should be automatic. Letting you know these people want to keep these racist policies going. And that's what was going on in 1866. It said it was slavery in all but its name. Oh, let's call it something else. Then we can say, oh, it had nothing to do with race. But it has everything to do with race. It says, but the resulting controversy, along with other Southern laws restricting African American rights, helped lead to the military rule in the form of Confederacy and Congressional Reconstruction. It is unknown to what degree it was enforced, but Vagrancy Act remained law in Virginia until 1904. So almost an additional 40 years of slavery for a lot of our people. The rabbit hole gets deep. So I want to read, before we continue in this article, the Freedmen's Bureau to the right. It states the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man. In 1866, political poster demonized the newly freed African American as being idle at the expense of the white man, which they do today. They demonize us and say, oh, no, Negro's idle and it's on our dollar. No, it's on our dollars too. Black people work too. Black people pay taxes too. We don't even get to choose where these taxes are allocated and how they're allocated. Your roads in your community don't have potholes because you go to council and complain. We go to the council and complain and we lose our homes. It's a big difference. And we still pay taxes. But it says a cartoon portrays a barefoot black man in tattered clothes. And what do you mean at the expense of the white man? Hold on, I just got to make these sidebars. I'm going to make sidebars this whole video. You just became the richest nation on earth by the slave trade, by cotton, by the sugar plantations. That what made you the richest country on earth. And you have the audacity to say of the expense of the white man. How about the expense of the Negro man that you raped, pillaged, and forced him into servitude? How about that? For free. It says a cartoon portrays a barefoot black man in tattered clothes lunging in the foreground while white men are hard at work plowing a field. Caption, in the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread. And chopping wood. Caption, the white man must work to keep his children and pay his taxes. In contrast, the African Americans quoted as saying, "War is the use for me to work as long as they make these appropriations." The poster takes aim at the expense and perceived wastefulness of the Freedom's Bureau, which was established to protect the newly freed slave population. A fictional image of Freeman's Bureau building, modeled to look like the U.S. Capitol, bears the following motto beneath the dome: freedom and no work. The pillars of the building read left to right: candy, rum, gin, whiskey, sugar, plums, indolence, white women, apathy, white sugar, idleness, fish balls, clams, stews, and pies. This poster was one series of broadsides produced in support of the Heister Clymer, an 1866 candidate for the governor of Pennsylvania, who was running on a white supremacy platform against the Republican candidate John W. Gary Clymer, lost in the subsequent election. Original author unknown, created in 1866. Courtesy of Library of Congress, Prints and Photographs Division. So a lot of stuff they say about our people and try to make these blanket statements they were saying back then. And they use this type of propaganda to enforce the Vagrancy Act, which put a lot of our people back into slavery. Oh, they're idle. No, they're looking for employment and they're trying to find their children and wives that were sold to different slave masters. That's what was going on. Now, let's get back to the law itself. Here's the background. Virginia laws and practices derived in part from English precedent had long distinguished vagrants or vagabonds from poor people in general. In legislation passed in 1785 and revised 2 years later, the General Assembly established local boards to find paying work for poor people and provide minimal essential relief at public expense. Vagrants defined as not betaking themselves to honest occupations were treated differently. However, as early as 1748, Virginia law had described vagrants as idle and disorderly. In 1776, revisions authorized their arrest. Now, the law prescribes apprehension and forced labor. And if a vagrant would attempt to flee, he or they shall be dealt with in the same manner as other runaway servants. Lawmakers worried that vagrants will become beggars or even thieves and therefore treat them as a threat to public safety. At the end of the Civil War, white lawmakers similarly worried about the perhaps hundreds of thousands of African Americans who wandered the roads of Virginia. Many of them had just been freed from slavery. Many were without homes or steady work, and many journeyed in search of relatives who had been dispersed by the slave trade. Their freedom overturned a centuries-long racial hierarchy and left many whites concerned about public safety. Does that sound familiar? It's the same thing going on in 2017. And more importantly, white social and political supremacy by recalling old definitions of vagrancy, in fact, borrowing almost verbatim the definition found in the Pennsylvania law from 1836. The General Assembly found a convenient means of controlling these African Americans and subjecting them to punishments for unemployment or homelessness. So they see that we were in a dire state where we were looking for our relatives, where we were trying to find work. We had just been freed, and they criminalized us and made us go back into servitude. It says not all white politicians consider free people. In general, a nuisance and a message to the General Assembly dated December 4th, 1865. Governor Francis H. Pierpont, a Republican, explained that many former slaves worried that if they remained with their old masters, they would be in danger of re-enslavement, hence they become roving. Pierpont noted that where satisfactory wages are paid, African Americans often rendered fair service. So he's saying, look, they're not going to stay with their slave masters, because a lot of times these slave masters abuse the slaves. So they didn't want to stay there, so they had to leave and look for work. And that's what he meant by roving. They had to go and wander and find resources. And he says when they got their wages, the fair service was rendered. That's all you gotta do is pay them righteously. It says, but that such situations were rare, so they couldn't find satisfactory wages so they can take care of themselves and their families. It's that simple. For reasons of mutual distrust and in many cases ignorance of how the free labor system even worked, early attempts between black and white Virginians to enter into employment contracts had failed. Agents of the Bureau of Refugees, freedmen, and abandoned lands, as well as civil authorities in Virginia, were well aware of the many problems that occurred, but did not adequately address them. To be free, labor must be voluntary, Pierpont told the Assembly. Every effort to enforce it by law, except as a punishment for crime and vagrancy, will result in failure. Idleness brings its own punishment. After the most mature consideration I have been able to give to the subject, I think there's very little positive legislation needed in regard to this class. So let's get straight to the law. It says on January 9, 1866, the House of Delegates passed the act providing for the punishment of vagrants, with the Senate of Virginia following suit 6 days later. The law passed in both houses by voice vote, leaving no record of which delegates and senators voted for or against it. There was little or no newspaper commentary, reports, or legislators' speeches or explanations for their votes. There is no record of whether Pierpont supported or opposed the legislation. Either way, he did not have veto power. The law preamble states that there have lately been a great increase of idle and disorderly persons in some parts of this Commonwealth, an implicit reference to the abolition of slavery, which had displaced much of the state's large population of African Americans. Nothing comparable had happened to any appreciable number of white Virginians, suggesting that the law was intended to apply mainly to the former slaves. The preamble declares that if the state does not act, it will be overrun with dissolute and abandoned characters. As a remedy, the law authorized justices of peace and overseers of the poor to arrest vagrants and hire them out for any term not exceeding 3 months, and for the best wages that can be procured, all of which were to go for the use of any vagrant or his family. However, if any people so employed should, without sufficient cause, run away, then the law authorized harsh penalties. The vagrants were to be returned to their employers, for whom they would work for free, staying an extra month and wearing balls and chains. If no employer would take them, they would be forced to work on public projects, also for free, and still wearing balls and chains. Absent in suitable public projects, vagrants would be confined to jail and be fed only bread and water. None of the law's various precedents included provisions for wearing ball and chain. In this case, vagrants, specifically those who had fled forced slavery and been recaptured, were treated comparably to convicted felons who were taken out to work on public projects or hired to private employers. Meanwhile, the way in which law authorized mostly white men to hire out mostly black vagrants to private employers also almost and certainly reminded free people and others of the legal practice from slavery days, allowing counties and cities to require free African Americans who owed back taxes to be hired out as if they were slaves. So you can imagine what they did with this. You was convicted of vagrancy because you just came out of slavery. You don't have no home. You don't want to go back to your slave master. You're trying to look for work. You're trying to find your relatives. They put you in slavery for 3 months. Then you get released. Guess what happens? You get convicted again because the conundrum didn't go away. You still are in that predicament. You're still looking for a place. You're still roving. You're still wondering. You're trying to find suitable needs of hire, which we found out that failed in a lot of cases. Why? Because possibly a lot of these white people didn't want to hire these people for fair wages. Didn't want to hire African Americans for fair wages at this time because a lot of bitterness in the South existed after this Civil War. So this slavery continued after 1865. It continued. Okay, with this vagrancy law. We're going to keep going. It says the application and legacy. It says just 9 days after the Vagrancy Act passage, the commanding general of the U.S. Army in Virginia, Alfred H. Terry, issued a proclamation forbidding civil and military officials in the state from enforcing it. Dated January 24, 1866. The proclamation attempted to provide context to the law. According to Terry, white employers were conspiring to pay former slaves wages below the real value of their labor, and presumably in reference to the practice of hiring out slaves far below the price formerly paid to masters for labor performed by their slaves. As a result, wages utterly inadequate to the support of themselves and their families had become normal. And that's what I was talking about. So they was like, damn, they can't find any good jobs. So they go back into peonage, back into vagrancy, trying to find a job, and then they get convicted. And it's called convict leasing, and we're going to get right into that right after this article. It states the Vagrancy Act, Terry wrote, would only encourage artificially low wages by compelling freemen to accept employment. And even where conspiracies to lower wages did not exist, the temptation to form them offered by the statute will be too strong to be resisted. The ultimate effect of the statute, Terry wrote, will be to reduce the freemen to a condition of servitude worse than that from which they had been emancipated, a condition which will be slavery in all but its name. So slavery continued. It continued. 1865, after the emancipation, you had this law passed, 1866, and this continued to 1904. It was outlawed 40 years later. So these slave masters lowered their wages. So even if they worked with these guys, they went back to these slave masters or these hiring whites, the African Americans still suffered because they didn't have enough money to support them and their families. And they were back in a condition worse than slavery. Or they were convicted for vagrancy and then went to convict leasing. A vicious cycle that kept going. It says Terry's conclusions prompted some white Virginians to deny that the law was designed to apply only to African Americans. There you go. When you bring up something racist today, oh, that could have happened to anybody. Oh, when you bring up extreme poverty and how our people live in the ghettos and so, oh, white people live in the ghettos and slums too. But how many compared to us? We can clearly see that these laws are affecting us, and we're not worried about integration. We're worried about economic integration because we all pay taxes. We all work. Why am I not receiving the benefits? Why are my people not receiving the benefits? Why can't I have a nice community? Why can't I have nice schools? Okay? Even though I pay taxes. But you're going to say race has nothing to do with it. It's like they're hypnotists. They're going to put you back to sleep. They're going to play hypnosis. They're going to swing the pendulum in your face and going to put you back in sleep. And say, oh, there's no race issues. There's nothing, Congress is not worried about race. The people of America, we're beyond that. You're thinking in the past, man. It's still going on. They're going to continue saying, oh, it's not race-based, but it's obviously race-based. It says, back to it, it says, Terry's conclusion prompted some white Virginians to deny that the law was designed to apply only to African Americans, perhaps to remove the taint of slave hiring from the new law. The editor of the Richmond Daily Dispatch wrote in the editorial, in fact, the law is applicable to all persons without distinction of color. We have seen white men convicted of vagrancy under the old law and public get hired out. There you go, right there. It is unknown whether many overseers of the poor and justice of the peace defied Terry and attempted to enforce the laws, or whether, if they did, the army intervened. The law may have resulted in the arrest of some free people, but its large consequences related to the public opinion. Terry's proclamation drew national press coverage to the situation of free people in Virginia. This likely contributed to congressional sentiment that full freedom for former slaves could not be entrusted to public officials in states of former Confederacy, where restrictive laws known as black codes were regularly being passed. In 1866, just 5 months after the passage of the Vagrancy Act, Congress submitted the 14th Amendment to the states for ratification. It granted African Americans the right to citizenship and guaranteed their rights as citizens. In March 1867, Congress placed Virginia and the other former Confederate states under military rule to prevent civil officers from obstructing congressional reconstruction. The Vagrancy Act remained on the books until 1904. Although it was amended in 1874, 1886, 1895, 1899, it continued to retain provisions requiring some vagrants to wear a ball and chain. In January 1904, a new law in the Act of Relations to Vagrancy replaced the Vagrancy Act, making vagrancy a misdemeanor punishable by bond payment and good conduct for 1 year. So they couldn't do convict leasings no more after 1904. They wasn't supposed to legally. So this was a way to put our people back into slavery. And then when people say, oh, white people fall into it too, that's just a smoke screen. That's a smoke screen to get you away from what this law was intended to do, which was to recapture, re-enslave thousands upon thousands, if not millions, of African Americans. Okay, now I'm using that term African American because that's familiar to a lot of my viewers. They know what I'm talking about. So they have the sources here, the timeline and everything. You can, as I said before, I will be putting the link to this website within the description. It's the encyclopediavirginia.org. So let's go from here. Let's go to convict leasing. It says this is pbs.org and it's slavery by another name. It says convict leasing. After the Civil War and the South economy, society and government were in shambles. Southern state governments struggled to raise money to repair damaged infrastructure and to support new expenses such as universal public education. The prison problem was especially challenging, as most prisons had been destroyed during the war. Previously, African American slaves had been subjected to the punishments at the hands of their owners. With the government ineffectiveness and increase in both white and black lawlessness, the problem were how to house convicts was significant. Initially, some states paid private contracts to house and feed the prisoners. Within a few years, states realized they could lease out their convicts to local planters or industrialists who would pay minimal rates for the workers and be responsible for their housing and feeding, thereby eliminating costs and increasing revenue. Some markets for convict laborers developed with entrepreneurs buying and selling convict labor leases. Unlike slavery, employers had only a small capital investment in convict laborers and little incentive to treat them well. Convict laborers were often dismally treated, but the convict lease system was highly profitable for the states and the employers. As public sympathy grew towards the plight of the convict laborers, southern states struggled over what to do. The loss of revenue was significant and the cost of housing convicts high. Eventually, many southern states stopped leasing out their convict laborers, instead keeping them to work on public projects and chain gangs. So hopefully I can play this video. I'm doing this for educational purposes without getting a strike. So let's play it.
Convict leasing in the South in this period becomes a new way of racial control among white Southerners attempting to limit African American economic independence and freedom in general. And what that means is that state officials would sell the labor of an African American prisoner to a private contractor. The terms of that agreement usually involved a period of time, say 10 days for a very minor sentence, to up to a year. And in exchange for getting the labor of the prisoner and taking full custody of the prisoner by the private contractor, the state would receive revenue. What that meant in terms of what convict leasing involved was that African Americans would work in any industry, whether working for a private farmer, whether it was in a brick-making factory, a coal mine, any number of business concerns, and the business owner would have absolute dominion over the black person for the period of time of the lease. But once you were in the system, you could spend the rest of your life there. And that was a direct consequence of the reality of being a convict lease and having to fight literally to survive day by day in incredibly brutal conditions.
So this is very pertinent information. We have to know this because when you look at the state of African Americans, Native Indians, and Hispanics, we have to know why we're in this condition. We're always saying, oh, we're thugs, we're this, we're drug dealers, we can't get right, we can't pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. It's a reason behind that, and not saying that we don't have responsibility. We accept all responsibility for what the evils and crimes that our people do, but the opposition has to do the same thing. Because we always look at where we're at and what we do, but we don't ask the most important question, why? Once we understand these things, we can tear down these mental walls that prevent our people from growing. Okay? We have to know this history. Convict leasing, like he said, a lot of African Americans stayed in convict leasings for their whole life, fighting for survival. Made slaves all over again, off of petty crimes, off of laws that attack them, that the intent of the law was to make them convicts so they can make money off of them and put them back into servitude, like the Vagrancy Act. And now we're going to talk about peonage. And we're going to read the article, we're going to play the video, because we have to know this. Slavery versus peonage. Peonage, also called debt slavery or debt servitude, is a system where an employer compels a worker to pay off a debt with work. Legally, peonage was outlawed by the Congress in 1867. However, after Reconstruction, many Southern black men were swept into peonage through different methods, and the system was not completely eradicated until the 1940s. This system did not go away until the 1940s. This enslavement of black people, African Americans, and Indians who were considered Negro or colored because you had the binary law. You were either black or white. And to this day, we're still sticking to that racist system that's backed up by quote-unquote DNA. But you know it's falsified. It's the same thing. They base everything off of looks. They don't base off of real ancestry. That's why they ask you for the skin color, your eye color, or your hair texture. They want to know your name. They're going to make this guess who you are. That's why if you go to the same DNA place or different DNA places, you're going to get different results. It's that simple. It's the same system. Same system, different name. But as you can see, peonage was dealing with African Americans. They fell into it all the way to the 1940s. So really, black people haven't had a lot of black people did not have a break for about 60, 70 years. And then we know what happened in the 50s and the 60s with the Black Power movement, the fights for civil rights, and then the Reaganomics, then the crack era. You couple that together, we have been going up. We've been fighting an uphill battle our whole time in America. Just tell it how it is. Just tell it how it is. Prison to Pipeline, School to Prison Pipeline, The New Jim Crow. That's a real good book. You have to purchase that and read that book and digest that book. But let's continue in the article. It says, in some cases, employers advance workers some pay or initial transportation costs, and workers willingly willingly agreed to work without pay in order to pay it off. Sometimes those debts were quickly paid off and a fair wage worker-employer relationship established. In many more cases, however, workers became indebted to planters through sharecropping loans, merchants through credit, or company stores through living expenses. Workers were often unable to repay the debt and found themselves in a continuous work without pay cycle. But the most corrupt and abusive peonage occurred in concert with southern states and country government in the South. Many black men were picked up for minor crimes or on trumped-up charges. And when faced with staggering fines and court fees, forced to work for a local employer, who would pay their fines for them. They need to correct that. It should be who would pay, not would who. Southern states also leased their convicts en masse to local industrialists. The paperwork and debt record of individual prisoners was often lost, and these men found themselves trapped in an inescapable situation. So again, they were in lifetime servitude all over again. And this didn't end in the 1940s. Legally. So, I'm going to play the video. Again, this is for educational purposes.
Peonage is simply, as you can define it, is debt servitude. It means you're being forced to work out a debt, and there's a federal statute that says it's against the law. The problem here was you could owe somebody money, and if they wanted that money to compel the money, they could sue you. But of course, suing an agricultural worker is probably not going to work. So that's why they resorted to compulsion. Is that a civil case was not going to get them their money back. They were going to have to compel the labor from these people. And labor control was a central theme of Southern history. Peonage flourished because it preyed on people who were vulnerable, workers who basically would get in debt, and they didn't know that they could not be forced to work it out. And so they were preyed upon.
The video's playing. The audio's playing twice. Let me see if I can reload it.
Peonage is simply, as you can define it, is debt servitude. Who were vulnerable, workers who basically would get in debt, and they didn't know that they could not be forced to work it out. And so they were preyed upon. So it varied: farmers, people working on the railroads, people doing construction work, people working in turpentine camps. All these people were vulnerable to being held for debt. So it spread. It just seemed like people who were the employers understood they could use this compulsion, usually without fear of prosecution. There are all kinds of examples you could give of how this was done. One of the most interesting ones was in Florida, where immigrants from the north were brought down. They had to pay their transportation to Florida. They were sent out on keys to build a railroad. They were held there. Their debts increased. They couldn't escape. So they, because a lot of them didn't even speak English, didn't know this was against the law. So that was one way. There were other ways with agricultural workers who would sign a contract and then not work out the contract, be prosecuted before the law, and then they would be said, you have to work out your debt or go to the chain gang. To even give a little bit of evidence of how bad it was, you need to go to the National Archives and read the complaints of people who were peons. They complained of beatings, they complained of murders, they complained of being chained, they complained of almost any ill treatment you can administer to a person. It was as bad as it can get.
So you see that this ugly history wavers and hangs over the head of America, because a lot of this is their fault. We had nothing to do with this. You see what I'm saying? And when you see Edomites or Caucasian, they will always try to say, oh, you black people, of course you're in the situation you're in. Look at your crime rate. You got the highest crime rate or highest violent crime. You sell drugs. You do this to your community. You can't gather together. Yeah, we do those things. Our people are guilty of a lot of those things. But your people are guilty for creating the environment and continue to support the environment that we're in. You're guilty for that because you continue to make laws and pass laws and support murderers of our people and support anything evil or wicked against our people. okay, like this peonage law, okay, the vagrancy law, and you name it. You keep naming laws and laws and laws. We just had a case in, I believe, Missouri, of 2013, a school that didn't qualify for funding no more, and there was a law in that state where they could go to another district, and that other district was predominantly white. So those parents and those people that were going to that school, they fought against the enrollment of black kids. And the school that the black kids came for paid $4 million to the other district. And guess what? After they fought for those kids to not go there no more, what they did is they made a law where they didn't have to pay for the busing. So these kids were poor. They lived in the ghetto. There was no way that they could pay for busing all the way, miles and miles away from their homes to go to the district. So they were defeated and had to go back to that school that was not getting funding. And guess what? The white school district kept the $4 million. Talk about injustice. This happened in 2013. But no, y'all have no hand in our defeat. You have no hand in our status here in society. You have no hand. It has nothing to do with y'all. Okay, great. Continue to do that. There's a God, and He will give forth just judgment. That's all I have to say on that. But the point of this presentation was to show Peonage, Vagrancy Act, and Convict Leasing. We have 2 more articles to read. The video, it had a few issues in it. They have to, I guess, go back and correct that. But again, pbs.org, Slavery by Another Name. The themes is peonage. So next article is Digital History, and it's about the convict lease system that we touched on earlier. digitalhistory.uh.edu, and I will be posting all of the links within the description. So if you want to read this on your own or share it on the social media platforms to your friends and family, you can do that. Again, it will be in the description of the video. All right, so it says, while most believe that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, a loophole was opened that resulted in a widespread continuation of slavery in the southern states of America. Slavery as a punishment for a crime, according to the 13th Amendment, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, nor any place subject to their jurisdiction. Convict leasing began in Alabama in 1846 and lasted until July 1st, 1928. This didn't end in 1928, man. Because a lot of people think, oh, slavery just ended in 1865. No, it didn't. It existed in a new name, right? Like peonage, vagrancy, convict leasing. When Herbert Hoover was vying for the White House in 1883, about 10% of Alabama's total revenue was derived from convict leasing. In 1898, nearly 73% of total revenue came from the same source. 73%. That's almost all. Three. Come on, man. That's majority of the economy of Alabama came from convict leasing. See, the work and the blood, sweat, and tears of our people has funded this country for years, and we still have the biggest buying power in the country. That's crazy. We literally built this economy. It says 70% of the total revenue came from the same source in Alabama. Convict leasing. Making our people go back into servitude by saying, oh, he committed a crime, or, trumped up his charges like we read earlier. Death rates that's why you see young black males, when they do a petty crime and they get a large sentence, 30 years for nothing. 30 years for loitering or something simple as that. And he's like, why did he get that charge? Because they're trying to make money off of him. They're trying to basically convict lease again. Now they're not calling it by name because it's outlaw, right? They're still making money off these private owned prisons. We know they're getting kickbacks. Come on now. This is public knowledge. It says death rates among leased convicts were approximately 10 times higher than the death rates of prisoners in non-leased states. In 1873, for example, 25% of all black leased convicts died because they treated the convicts harshly. They beat him, murdered him when he was working on the railroads, coal caves and stuff like that, mining coal. They were getting killed. Possibly the greatest impetus to the continued use of the convict labor in Alabama was the attempt to depress the Union movement. Convicts were invariably leased to the prominent and wealthy Georgian families who worked them on railroads and coal mining. Arkansas actually paid companies to work their prisoners for much of the time the system was in place. No state official was empowered to oversee the plight of the prisoners, and business had complete autonomy in the disposition and working conditions of convict laborers. Mines and plantations that used convict laborers commonly had secret graveyards containing the bodies of prisoners who had been beaten and or tortured to death. Convicts would be made to fight each other, sometimes to the death, for the amusement of the guards and wardens. Unlike the other southern states, only half of Texas inmates were black. Blacks were sent to sugar plantations. The southern states were generally broke and could not afford either the cost of building and maintaining prisons. The economic but morally weak and incorrect solution was to use convicts as a source of revenue, at least, to prevent them from draining the fragile financial positions of the states. The abolition of the system was also motivated mostly by economic realities. While reformers brought the shocking truths and abuses of the notorious system before the eyes of the world, the real truth was far different. In every state, the evils of convict labor and abuses were in newspapers and journals within 2 years of implementation and were generally repeated during every election cycle. The convict leasing system was not abolished but merely transformed. Prisoners who labored for private companies and businesses, increasing their profits, now labored for the public sector. The chain gang replaced plantation labor. During the 1880s, many African Americans continued to vote in the South. The physical segregation of the races, which a later generation took for granted, was not yet a codified system. But beginning in Florida, in 1887, southern states moved to separate the races on the railroads. After 1900, segregation spread to nearly every facet of southern life. In 1890, Mississippi adopted several devices, including the poll tax and literacy test, and to disenfranchise African Americans. All other southern states followed suit by 1910. And the reason why they would do this is because they know blacks were complaining about convict leasing, peonage, vagrancy, and all these things that were attacking them, black codes. So they say, okay, we don't want blacks trying to vote away these things. See, they don't talk about that part. They didn't want blacks to vote away these peonage laws, these convict leasing laws that put them in horrible servitude, in some cases worse than actual slavery. So it's like, look, these Negroes are irate, they're mad. Don't allow them to vote. That's include a poll tax, a literacy test. A lot of them can't read. A lot of them can't write. So if they can't pass a literacy test, then they're not going to be able to do what? They're not going to be able to vote. They're not going to be able to get rid of this monster that's on their back. It wouldn't matter anyway, because they did it. They would just rewrite a law and then put them right back in servitude. That's how they work. It says, while race relations worsened in the late 1880s and 1890s, it is a hotly contested question. In part, it reflected the collapse of the cotton economy, which led many whites to search for scapegoats. So a lot of people say, well, I'm not multi-millionaires anymore with this cotton, so I'm not making as many bales of cotton. So guess what? I need to find a scapegoat, something that I can put in place of cotton. I'll put in place of my old business, which was off the backs of African Americans. Oh, I know what I can do. I can convict African Americans. I can do convict leasing. I can put them under the vagrancy law. I can put them on the peonage and make them pay me and make them work for me the rest of their life. Mountain discrimination was related to a fear among many Southern whites that a new generation of African Americans, which had been born after the Civil War and had not been subjected to slavery, would not defer to white authority. In addition, the extreme violence was a reaction against the increasing economic independence of Southern blacks. From 1880 to 1900, black farm ownerships increased from 19.6 to 25.4%, while sharecropping declined from 54% to 37.9%. So they didn't want to see us do well economically, so they crippled us, man, with these different laws, okay, with these different policies and practices. That Continue, 1928, 1940. That's recent history. We have to understand these things. Our people have been crippled. You got to know where you've been and know where you're going. Understand that. And this is the last article. Again, I will be posting all the article links within the description of the video. Be sure to subscribe and like the video. Comment below if you agree or disagree, respectfully. Genesis 49ers. But this is the BusinessInsider.com, 2 forms of slavery that still exist in America. And this was written, I believe, February 23rd, 2012. It is almost surprising that the concept of slavery is very foreign to those living in the developed world, especially the U.S., since it was extensively practiced as recently as 70 years ago. What's more disturbing about this ignorance is the fact that the system of post-Civil War slavery in the U.S. was not so different than the systems of slavery many Americans and Europeans will be experiencing in upcoming years. Indeed, I'm sure many people will probably take offense to such comparison even being made, as they feel it demeans the atrocious acts committed in the past. I would argue, however, that we demean history by failing to understand it and learn from it. Many people refer to the debt slavery when referencing current policies of the West, especially in Greece right now, where the concept has become very real, but they perhaps still underestimate how bad it can get. These systems of slavery are primarily born out of deeply rooted economic structures which foster high levels of dependency, greed, and malice by those with unchecked levels of political power. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, these powerful groups consisted of wealthy Southern agricultural and industrial elites. In his book, Slavery by Another Name, Douglas A. Blackmun documents how very few of the 4 million slaves that existed at the end of the Civil War were actually allowed to realize their freedom until decades later. And that was the whole purpose of this video. Many people think, oh, slavery just stopped in 1865. No, it didn't. A lot of forces and powers that be made laws and policies to ensure that we were enslaved and continue our enslavement. And that's what he brought out in his book. As the white middle class of the South grew from 1870 to 1950, with the exception of some years encompassing the Great Depression, due in no small part to the success of Southern industry, the blacks were kept in their chains through various mechanisms such as convict leasing, debt peonage, over and above the outright discrimination and violence that they also suffered. The Southern convict leasing systems were a means of extending slavery for African Americans well past the Civil War, Emancipation Proclamation, and the 13th and 14th Amendments. Southern laws were crafted to guarantee that the now free African Americans will be incarcerated at much higher rates than whites. Blacks were picked up, hauled off, and locked up for ridiculous crimes such as vagrancy, being homeless or unemployed, loitering in public, speaking loudly in the company of white women, or selling foreign products after dark, to name only a few. So it's just ridiculous. Like today, ridiculous charges for little petty crimes. Once these people were matriculated into the prison system, they had effectively become slave laborers again. The state allowed convicts to be leased out to private corporations for a little more than a pittance. Convict laborers were rented out at monthly rates that represented 50 to 80% discount over the wages paid to free laborers. They were forced to work in some of the most dangerous environments at the time, laying railroad and mining coal. And a significant percentage developed severe illness, injuries, and died in the course of such work. It is estimated that at least 9,000 convict workers were murdered or died of natural causes over a few decades under this system alone. As one historian described it, the system was brutal in a social sense, but fiendishly rational in an economical sense. That is really the crux of the whole matter. The Southern plantation economy, as well as the newly developed transport industries, was very dependent on extremely low-cost labor in both an economic and psychological sense. Convict leasing proved to be even more profitable than slavery in many cases, since there was really no need to keep the workers healthy and alive for very long. And that's the thing, since they're convicts, they didn't have to worry about doctor visits or nothing like that. Because they're criminals, remember? They don't deserve that. Many African Americans were also played, and I want you to also remember this part. In both economic and psychological sense, convict leasing proved to be even more profitable than slavery in many cases. Keep that in mind. Remember that. It says many African Americans were also placed in peonage or debt servitude, despite the fact that the federal government made it illegal after the accession of New Mexico in the U.S. and the Civil War. These blacks were typically accused of falsely owing money or tribal sums, given sham trials, and quickly sold off by the courts into a privatized system of debt slavery. The peonage contracts contained horrifying terms allowing the employer to trade, confine, whip, and beat workers as long as the debt was deemed unpaid, which could practically last forever. It was established that some of the wealthiest Alabama farmers had their own justice of peace, who would fraudulently try and convict blacks on charges of unpaid debts. So they had the law, just like a lot of them had lawmakers in their hands. They had them back then in their hands, and guess what? They kept inflicting pain, putting us in servitude, and making these ridiculous contracts with us. The federal government launched an investigation into these practices, and an Alabama court convicted a few farmers of public bribes and illegal debt peonage. However, they were given minimum sentences and then pardoned by President Theodore Roosevelt shortly after. And it shows you they don't give a damn about it. Oh, we don't care. It's just black people. It's African Americans. We're going to give them the light sentence, a slap on the wrist. They didn't do anything wrong. The president, what? He pardoned their damn crimes. Sound familiar? That goes on today. Oh my. Look, man. Learn your history. That's all I'm going to say. Despite the investigation and state court ruling, this practice continued in many southern states for years after. Another less explicit form of forced labor was sharecropping, in which the poor black farmers theoretically received a percentage of the profits from sale of certain crops grown by them. However, these workers were forced to take out relatively large loans just to meet daily expenses, and these loans sometimes carried interest rates up to 50 to 60%. At the end of the day, many of these sharecroppers were treated just like slaves and received very little compensation for their work beside the basic necessities of life. It is probably quite obvious to most readers how all the mechanisms of forced labor and debt slavery are still being practiced today and are only getting worse. The prison industrial complex in the U.S. has become more extensive than ever, as the list of petty crimes for which people are incarcerated has grown larger, but still does not include corporate banking fraud or political corruption at the highest levels. There are, of course, many serious offenders in the system, but the point is that becoming ever easier for our modern slave master to blur the line. Then it has a chart of the prison population from 1925 to 2008. You can read and examine that chart on your own. Like I said, the articles will be in the description of the video. It says, foremost among the petty punishment is for drug use and addiction, which, as Dr. Guy Bormati has insightfully explained, are conditions that primarily develop from environmental influence at an early age, as opposed to genetics. The socioeconomic structures and growing wealth inequality embedded in our society, especially at this time of economic depression, places enormous amounts of stress on its poorest members and can literally rewire their brains in a way that eventually lead them down a path of self-defeating drug addiction and associated behaviors. U.S. Department of Justice prisons in 2010. In 2009, the most recent data available, 50% of state prison inmates were serving time for violent offenses, 19% for property, 18% for drug, and 9% for public order of other offenses. About half, 51% of federal inmates in 2010 were serving time for drug offenses, 35% for public order offenses, largely weapons and immigration, and less than 10% for each violent and property offenses. Instead of working to change our fundamental economic structures and mitigate the stress triggers, or society has sought to punish and rehabilitate these people by placing them in environments of unprecedented fear and stress, such as prison. Given the amount of money and resources poured into the war on drugs in the U.S. over the decades, there is never any shortage of people that can be easily sucked into the prison complex and then become a part of an enslaved labor force. Maintaining prisons in their population have become very costly to taxpayers, but that's the whole point. The growing and increasing outsourced U.S. prison workforce is frankly a wet dream for private corporations, just like Convict leasing system was for the southern corporate elites. They have already been stripped almost of all their freedoms through the system of incarceration and can be forced to work for very low wages and poor working conditions under very strict levels of order and discipline. This pool of enslaved labor exploded since the early 1970s, as shown above, and therefore has been thoroughly exploited by private corporations for many years. So here it is, the prisoners under state and federal jurisdiction that you're in, 2010. You can see another chart here. The jurisdiction refers to the legal authority of the state and federal correctional officials over a prisoner regardless of where the prisoner is held. And the source BGS, National Prison Statistics Program. And you can read and examine that chart on your own. On the top of that, the entire business of building and running both state and federal prisons has been in the process of being outsourced to private corporations as government come under fiscal pressure. This private interests now have even more incentive to help state and federal government maintain the currently elevated number of prisoners. In recent years, the annual percentage increase in prisoners has dropped off, but that's a problem, which can be easily solved by the powers that be. In addition, inevitable increases in crime rates associated with economic depression. The list of jailable offenses can simply be expanded along with their associated sentences, like they were for blacks after Reconstruction. Right now, we have millions of people up to their eyeballs in housing and consumer debts, paying upwards of 20% of interest on the credit cards and payday loans. It's an entrance system that forces people to work longer hours for fewer benefits and wages over time. But even as such, the titans of the industry and owners concentrated financial wealth are finding it difficult to squeeze enough blood from the stones. So what's to stop the corporate elites and their political judicial flacks from manufacturing debts out of thin air and exacting excessive wealth punishments from those with debts owed? In the follow-up this piece, we will look all the other ways in the era of global indebtedness today has come to resemble that of the post-Civil War enslavement of African Americans, except at a much larger scale. It is really so unimaginable that an average lower or middle class American family or all different races, although the racially divided inequality of the past is still with us in many real ways, can find themselves in literal contracts of debt peonage, despite the technical illegality of such contracts at this time. What is the likelihood that laws be rewritten or ignored, and how easy it is for the line between financial harassment, abuse, and physical enslavement to simply disappear? So, and it says, read the original article, The Atomic Earth, 2012. So that's the final one, and I just wanted to bring out how slavery continued and how it still is going on today in prisons and still affecting a lot of African American and Hispanic men. And like again, where was this first strike? Where is this equal opportunity when 1865 occurred, 1866 occurred, the Vagrancy Act occurred, convict leasing happened, peonage happened, and all these things helped cripple our nation from 1865 to 1940. Where's this first shake? And then we already know what happened in the 50s and the 60s, heroin, the crack epidemic, Reaganomics, the attack on our leaders, Malcolm X get killed, Martin Luther King get killed, Huey Newton get killed, right? We know what happened. We know these things happen. When did we get this first shake? We didn't. So we have to rebuild and educate ourselves and know what happened to know where we're going and know how to fix our social ills amongst our community. Okay? So this has been Genesis 49ers. We say no to vague interpretations. We give thorough breakdowns. We have thoroughly broke down this subject, slavery by another name, right? Remember these terms: convict leasing, write it down, take your notes. Peonage, or debt slavery, and vagrancy. The Vagrancy Act of 1866 and different vagrancy laws, which made our people convicts and made them go into convict leasing and made them be put back into servitude. With that, I say shalom. I pray that this was very informal, very educational, that you got something from this. I pray that you brothers and sisters grow, you learn, and we become wiser, and we become scholars. Okay, it's time to up our scholarship. No more dogmatic principles. Let's become more pragmatic so we can actually build our nation and we can make things that can be practically used, like learning centers, literacy center. A lot of people still struggle reading. A lot of people still struggle writing. We need a literacy center. We need our own libraries. We need our own therapists. Okay, a lot of our people have a lot of psychological ills. So let's think practically, not dogmatically, right? Think of things we need. After school centers, help our kids out, free tutoring, okay? Volunteer tutoring. So if a kid or a child in our community is suffering in a course like math, we can help them. Or suffering in a course like creative writing, English, anything. we can find people to help them. Computer programming, we can find people to help in those areas so we can pull our people up and not drag them down. When you incite crime and you want to be a drug dealer, you are help dragging our community down. You are help killing our people off. We're trying to build and revive our people spiritually, mentally, and psychologically so we can grow and get over this post-traumatic slave disorder that a lot of our people go through. A lot of our women are living as bad wenches. A lot of our people are living as thugs. A lot of our men are living as thugs. We have to get away from that. That's not our culture. Our culture is manufactured in America. That's fake, false. Our real culture is Hebraic. Okay? You are the Israelites that the Bible speaks of. Our culture is not smoking weed. Our culture is not living off some woman. Okay? Our culture is not welfare food stamps, twerking, go to club every Friday. That's not our culture. Right? Sagging. That's not our culture. Our culture is wearing fringes, growing our beards, being men, and having the fortitude to fight against the social ills and giving solutions to the social ills of our people. Because you see that we have a monster on our back. We have a beast on our back, which is this government. And they have done nothing but hurt us. So we have to work together in peace and harmony and grow and educate ourselves and become wise. Right? Wisdom is better than a sword. Understand that. Wisdom is better than a gun. Wisdom can free us. So, again, I say shalom, peace to all the people that have been supporting the channel. Like, subscribe, share on the social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram.